Aloha, everyone. Welcome to another Daily Dose here with Precious and Kaliko from the Minority Cannabis Business Association. How's it going today, Precious?
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us for another edition of the Daily Dose. And this one is definitely a dose indeed. So, Kaliko, I'll let you just jump right into it because it's pretty exciting news.
Yeah, breaking news this afternoon. We actually had an entirely different topic to talk about today. But breaking news out of the White House, President Biden has announced that he is going to pardon all federal possession related marijuana charges. And he announced it today on his Twitter account. Just broke, the tweet went out at noon Pacific time, so just over an hour ago. I'm going to go ahead and just read the tweet thread and then we'll go ahead and discuss it because this is definitely big news and something I don't think a lot of advocates were expecting, but definitely is going to be something that's going to legitimately change lives. So I'll go ahead and read his tweet thread here first. So first tweet says, as I've said before, no one should be in jail just for using or possessing marijuana. Today, I am taking steps to end our failed approach. Allow me to lay them out. First, I am pardoning all prior federal offenses for simple marijuana possession. There are thousands of people who have been previously convicted of simple possession who may be denied employment, housing, or educational opportunities as a result. My pardon will remove this burden. Second, I'm calling on governors to pardon simple state marijuana possession offenses. Just as no one should be in federal prison solely for possessing marijuana, no one should be in jail or state prison for that reason either. Third, we classify marijuana at the same level as heroin and more serious than fentanyl. It makes no sense. I'm asking Secretary Becerra of the Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to initiate the process of reviewing how marijuana is scheduled under federal law. I'd also like to note that as federal and state regulations change, we will still need important limitations on trafficking, marketing, and underage sales of marijuana. Sending people to jail for possessing marijuana has upended too many lives for conduct that is legal in many states. That's before you address the clear racial disparities around prosecution and conviction. Today, we begin to right those wrongs.
Yeah. See, it's so much to unpack there because I think a lot of people didn't expect this. President Biden is usually quiet around cannabis, even though a lot of action is happening around him from what's happening with things in the House and Senate with safe banking to the recent federal legalization bills that are being put to the floor. So I do think this comes as a delightful shock. That's just my initial reaction to go on Twitter and have the whole industry just all high fiving each other virtually, physically, because this is essentially what we think is the first step. Before we talk about business, before we talk about operations and regulations around cannabis, the first step should always have been decrim, in my opinion. The first step should always be, well, the people who are currently sitting in jail, in prison, while this industry is happening around them, what are we currently doing to get them out of that position? What are we currently doing to right those wrongs? And not in pretty language tucked in a bill, but direct and outright. So I'm super pumped about this and can't wait to see the follow through. But yeah, this should have been the first step from a while ago. What about your thoughts, Kaliko?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there have been so many advocates who have been working on this for years, right? Like something like this, where the president comes out and makes a statement, isn't something that just happens overnight. It's something that takes a lot of work to be working through the legal departments and through all of the sort of advisors that would be around a president to make this sort of decision and working with the Department of Justice. So this is a really big deal. I know folks like Weldon Angelos has been out there doing a lot of work trying to work around expungements and getting people out of jail. You have the Last Prisoner Project, who obviously centers this in a lot of their work. SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, has been on a multi-state tour over the last couple of weeks, actually specifically pushing this point to get President Biden to make good on his campaign promises to release all nonviolent cannabis offenders, which he's now making good on, right? We're just over a month away from the midterm elections, which is so much of the outcome of the midterm elections is going to determine the outcomes of cannabis advocacy going forward. I think for folks who may not know kind of the politics in DC right now, the Democrats control both the House and the Senate. And even with that control, we haven't been able to get things through like the Safe Banking Act the more after all of these things that the sort of industry and the movement has been behind. So if the Democrats were to lose the House in November and the Republicans were to take over, it is even less likely that we would see any sort of advocacy actually being advanced at the federal level over the next few years. So this is a really big deal that Biden is doing this just a month out from the election, when the Democrats need a little bit of juice to maintain their position of holding the House. And ultimately for us on the advocacy side means that there's still light at the end of the tunnel, that we can keep working to get some federal stuff done, because, especially saying this is just the first step, right? We want to talk about all of the nuances of building the industry and regulating it. But if we can't agree on these very simple things, which is that no one deserves to be in jail for possessing a plant, then it's hard to do all those other things.
No, I completely agree. And for everyone who's tuning in on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, feel free to drop your questions. Feel free to drop your comments. We'll try to get to them. Our delightful operations manager, Sam, is picking up your questions and sending it to us. So definitely join in on the conversation. We want to know your thoughts on the latest breaking news coming out of the administration, what this could mean moving forward, and how this can potentially lead up to a pathway of legalization. So, Kalika, I really wanted to focus on the other aspect, which was descheduling, to initiate that review process and to not necessarily have marijuana at the same standard, which he said on the tweet, as fentanyl. What does that process usually, what do you think that process would be like? How do we get there? Is it a long, drawn out process? Will this get some political heat? You're in politics too, so can you just kind of warm it up for us, what that might look like?
Yeah, for sure. So for folks at the very baseline, the federal schedule basically stacks every different type of drug into a different schedule based on what they deem to be sort of like the benefits from a medical perspective and the potential for addiction, right? So the highest of those schedules being Schedule 1 is where cannabis, LSD, psilocybin, and a bunch of other sort of drugs sit, but it's actually above heroin and cocaine and some other things that sit at like Schedule 2, or even some like pharmaceutical drugs which sit at Schedule 3, but have high rates of addiction, right? So, I think it's really important that it's now being acknowledged that cannabis does not belong in Schedule 1. But I think from MCBA's standpoint and my standpoint personally, that it means that cannabis should be descheduled and delisted completely. It doesn't actually belong in any of those things because it does have medical benefits, and it does not really pose as much of a threat when it comes to addiction, right? And so in those ways, I think that cannabis actually needs to be descheduled. And when we're talking about rescheduling, there are different sort of regulations and sort of regulatory schemes that come into play when you move things from different schedules. So if we were to just simply reclassify cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, it would actually hinder a lot of what's happening in the cannabis industry right now, where we're doing a lot of the industry-based stuff, because Schedule 2 is really has to be tightly controlled. It's really pharmaceutical companies that are really able to maintain that sort of regiment of control that's required for something like a Schedule 2. So I think it's really important for us that are in the industry and trying to make sure that cannabis possession is both not something punishable by a crime, but also something that we can build into an industry to get more access to folks. It should be descheduled completely, not rescheduled. So I think that, in seeing that in this sort of announcement today, it's awesome that we recognize that it doesn't belong on Schedule 1. I think we're going to need to do a lot of education from the industry and the movement standpoint to make sure that we're not reclassifying it under something that's ultimately going to destroy what it is we've been building over the last nearly 10 years now.
That's very true. I haven't even thought about that in terms of all of the nuances that are already established for the industry as we've been operating from it being Schedule 1 and just literally finagling our way to still be able to serve a healing product, especially medicinally, to patients who absolutely need it. We have a couple questions coming in. I'll read one off right here from Gabrielle. How do you think this will affect the legal cannabis market in legalized states with adult use sales?
Yeah, for sure. I think immediately it's not really going to affect the industry. I think what's happened today is really a big monumental shift in terms of signaling from the White House, right? I think I've said this before in previous sort of panels I've been on, but when we talk about sort of the way things have been breaking out state by state and everyone having their own regime of how to control that, it's really because of the fear of a federal crackdown, right? So now that we know that the head of the federal government and President Biden, at least the executive branch of the federal government, and President Biden is no longer sort of seeing this as something that deserves people going to jail or that they will crack down on. I think one thing it will do is start to loosen things up a little bit at the state level. so that we can have less fear about the federal crackdown. But that means we have to continue to elect elected officials who ultimately are cannabis friendly when it comes to policy. Otherwise, we will continue to see the fear at the state level, which is why we set up such stringent sort of state level programs all the time, because they're so afraid of a federal crackdown. If we can remove the fear of that, a la sort of President Biden saying that he's willing to at least stop jailing people for possession, I do think that long term, that means like the monumental shift in how we're thinking about cannabis, which is that it doesn't deserve to be in the most controlled sort of regimen, but that it can be actually scaled back a little bit and loosened up. So I think immediately it's not going to have a lot of impact on state policy. Long term, this is signaling that federal prohibition is nearing the end, and we've been getting closer and closer as we go. But this is another really big proof that somebody who has had a long history of being a prohibitionist, frankly, and somebody who helped lead the drug war, helped sort of lead to more budgeting and funding of cops in the 90s, who really was thought of as being hard on drugs and hard on crime. The fact that he's shifting his thoughts on this is a really big deal.
Yeah, and even within his tweet, he mentioned he called on state governors to follow suit and also pardon simple state possession there. So you see him trying to rope things in, knowing that the states will still hold a lot of power when it comes to policy, which we've even seen in the different bills that come out. When you think of federal legalization, it still retains a lot of that compliance power to the states to be able to figure it out, because again, each state is different. So I think him calling on that is understanding exactly what you just said, that it's going to be a multifaceted effort for what's happening on the federal level to trickle down to the state, and then even get specifically down there into like the municipalities and the cities, who also hold a S-word amount of power when it comes to cannabis and how you're operating, which is also the most second important thing people can do, and you mentioned it, is to vote. Like now when you're voting, you really want to see what people's cannabis policies are and how they're going to affect the state you're in, and how that can either benefit your business, or whether you really want to throw a wrench in there and call a red flag and say, hey, this isn't what's going to build an equitable industry. So I thought it was intentional to make sure that the states were involved in there. So definitely
Absolutely.
a great.
Just to piggyback on that for a quick second, most of the sort of arrest and jail time and prison happens at the state and local level, right? So I think that's part of the sort of the discussion around that. It's a big deal that President Biden is making this this move, but we're talking probably less than 10,000 people who are currently in jail for possession only at the federal level, right? So it's going to be life-changing for those folks, but there are so many more folks who are jailed at the state and local level, because a lot of that sort of enforcement happens at the state and local level. So I think it is really important that President Biden is encouraging governors to do that, and sort of, in a lot of ways saying, hey, here's a little bit of political backing to do it without you feeling like you need to be afraid, or that you're somehow coming out of left field and doing this. Like, the president is now saying this is what should be done. So we do hope to see more governors actually follow suit.
Yeah, and again, leadership starts at the head. We have another question here. How do you think, this is from Chris, it was about cultivation charges. What about cultivation federal charges? Now, I know that there are different offenses when it comes to cannabis. They're simple and they're major, minor, versus more complex charges that add on even more time, even more legalese, if you will, in terms of figuring out, how those people will also not necessarily bear the same, jail and prison time compared to other kind of drugs that we've seen, that people also get disparaging prison times too. Now, I know that this is kind of like I always say cannabis is like baby steps. You're not going to get the whole elephant in the one bite. And I think over time there does need to have a conversation.
Precious, did we lose you? All right, I feel like we might have lost Precious, so I'm just going to keep going here. But I do think it was a very big deal, as we were talking about, with President Biden giving sort of the political cover for state level folks to be able to make these same changes. But as Precious was saying as well, I think it's really important that we keep the pressure up at the state and local level, right? We need to be able to lobby our local elected officials to make sure that they're actually able to do what they can to end the cannabis prohibition and ultimately make sure that people are not sitting in jail for it. So one thing I wanted to also mention, just that was really interesting on this point about specifically cultivation charges and these other sort of things, is that right now it is just for possession. That's what they're specifically focused on. But we do, as Precious was saying, need to move through our baby steps into making sure that this also includes cultivation or anything else, right? Like in our press release we just recently sent out, we basically said that no one belongs in jail for marijuana. And that means for any reason, right? Possessing, selling, growing. Like cannabis itself is not a dangerous substance, and therefore should not be treated as such. And therefore, we just don't believe that people should be in jail for any sort of dealing with any aspect of what is really the industry of cannabis. So this is a baby step. We do need to grow from here. We will continue to keep up the pressure on the Biden administration and elsewhere to make sure that people understand that any sort of aspect of this is not truly dangerous and putting people in harm's way. So yeah, I feel like, Precious, this has been really awesome. Like, once again, this was not what we planned to talk about today, but amazing news that we got out of the White House from President Biden. We will definitely make sure that we're continuing to keep people up to date about sort of the latest happenings in the industry here on the Daily Dose. We look forward to continuing to do this on a daily. If you guys have suggestions for topics you want us to cover, articles that you're reading about that you really want to sort of jam about a little bit, we're all game. So please feel free to send them over. Precious, I know you probably got some plugs we want to make sure we include as well.
Yeah, if you are a MCBA member, be sure to check your emails. We have a lot of programming going on this month of October. And if you're not, head over to our website. You'll be able to be there and join. And then even if you just want to support and or donate, you'll be able to find that link on our website, minoritycannabis.org, and really support us in our mission to further what we're seeing today and have a lot more of it come up. So like always, we appreciate you guys. We will see you tomorrow. And I'll grab your favorite flower today because it's definitely a celebratory kind of day.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Aloha.